Hello, I'm Professor Carol Wallace and I'm a trustee of the Royal Society for Public Health. I'm doing a series of video interviews in the area of food safety culture for our new special interest group, and I'm really delighted today to be joined by Professor Chris Griffith, who's one of the key experts in this field. So Chris, first of all, thank you for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
Okay. Food safety culture is something that's talked about everywhere nowadays, and many people, though, are still quite unsure of what it actually means. I thought it'd be nice to start if you could tell us a bit about the background and the development of the concept, please, Chris.
Well, I think you're perfectly correct. It has suddenly become, for want of a better phrase, a buzzword, and many people are talking about it. I'm not altogether sure that in many cases it's that informative. If I start off by perhaps going back a little bit in time, I started off with an interest in food safety as a microbiologist, and at the time was fairly naive in believing that if you wanted to improve food safety, all you had to do was to tell people what to do and then they would go away and do it. I soon realised that wasn't quite the case and started doing work, supervising some psychologists, looking at why people don't do what they know they should do in the realms of food hygiene. And from one of the studies that emerged, we started taking an interest in the concept of food safety culture. Now, roughly at the same time, we go back to about the year 2000, and there's a lovely quote by a man called Woolen, and he said, "There's millions of words written about food safety and millions of pounds spent on it, but the problem seems to be getting worse." Now, whether it's getting worse or not, we can talk about at a separate time. But there's a lot of books on microbiology and hard science and very little about the more softer psychological aspects of food safety. And at roughly the same time as that, there was a lot of work which stemmed from organisational culture work, which then moved more into safety aspects of culture. And people were realising that when unfortunate events occurred and they started investigating what the problem was, then it was the culture of the company that was the major contributory factor. And it was just a question of taking those concepts, linking it to the definition of a risk factor or an emerging pathogen, combining the two, and you end up with food safety culture as an emerging risk factor. So it's things we now realise are important that can have an influence on whether people will be ill from the food that they eat.
Yes, I guess it's been quite a long journey and we've still got quite a long way to go to.
I think we're only at the first few stages.
Okay, so if we could move on, maybe you could tell us what food safety culture actually means to you.
Okay, it's a very interesting concept to try and define, and you will find quite a few different definitions floating about. One of the earliest, if we go back to the organisational culture elements, one of the first attempts there was the way we do things around here. Now, I think that's very much a superficial definition of what food safety culture is. To me, it's much more about the underlying values and concepts that are deep within a business. And I think those help to explain what goes on within a company with respect to food safety. And I think I would add at that point that every business has a food safety culture. Now, the business may know it or they may not know it, but every business has one. And it's possible to sort of analyse that in two dimensions. One dimension is it a positive food safety culture or is it a negative one? Psychologists don't like talking about right and wrong, but they're happy to talk about a positive and a negative. And I would put in the middle of that something which we can explore in more detail if you wish, which is a problem with larger organisations, which is complacency, with the culture that exists. So we have a negative one, we can have a positive one, and we can have complacency. And the other dimension is how strongly that culture is embedded within the organisation. You can have a weak culture or you can have a strong culture. But to me, it's the underlying values, beliefs that drive how people behave.
So just to explore that a little bit further, because I'm interested if you could tell us what you feel are the key differences between food safety culture that we were talking about today and some of the previous approaches in food safety management. And so what I'm interested in is it a new concept? Is it something we were perhaps trying to establish before but not under that name? Just interested in your thoughts around that.
Well, I think it's always existed. We now are more able to define it and focus on it. So I think, and there's greater attention on it, but quite clearly, it's like the concept of the emerging pathogen. In many cases, those pathogens have existed, but we just didn't realise their importance and how they worked and so on. So I think it's not a new concept. It's not a new topic, but it might be the way we name it or talk about it. How does food safety culture differ in its approach from something like HACCP, which I know you're particularly involved with? The classical approach to food safety management has been on systems, and that is, this is what you should be doing, this is how we're going to organise it, and so on. Food safety culture is, so the driving thing is what you need to do. Food safety culture is much more about why you need to do it and persuading people that it needs to be done. So I don't see them as competition in any way, in fact quite the opposite. I see them as very much complementary. And if you want to produce safe food consistently, and I think the word consistency is important there, then you need to have the right systems, you need to have the proper systems in place, but you need to have the right culture to go with them.
Absolutely. So if we were to talk to some people who were perhaps doubting about the concept, what things would you tell them about why is it important, in other words, to establish a strong food safety culture?
Well, I think you could, at a simple level, answer that because it helps you to produce safe food and it helps you to comply with legislation. The compliance with legislation may save you money because you don't get fined and so on, but I would argue that one of the driving things behind the desire for a positive food safety culture is almost a moral dimension. I mean, I've been in food safety for 40 years and you get a bit familiar with it, and you certainly do training courses and you know, you often use examples and tell the same stories, and in a way you get a little bit distant from reality. And I think I was giving evidence to the South Wales E. coli inquiry, and to have the parents of Mason Jones listening to what I was saying after their son had died from a classic example of a poor food safety culture, and they were crying as I was giving evidence, really brings it home to you that there are people's lives at stake here. And I think there is a moral dimension to wanting to produce safe food. And it's something we often take for granted.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And it's certainly a very powerful tool to have the parents or people who've been involved in a food safety outbreak involved in talking to professionals, I think, to really get that message home.
They had a different dimension.
Absolutely. So just coming back to food safety culture, what does a positive food safety culture look like in a business?
A positive food safety culture is one where food safety is accorded a high priority. And one of the problems that exists within many businesses that contributes to a poor culture is the fact that food safety, which is part of the organisation's overall culture, has to compete with other elements. And I always say that one of the biggest enemies of a positive food safety culture is the economic aspects of culture, and particularly the desire to save money or maximise profitability. And I can give you a list of examples. If we just go back to the E. coli South Wales example, for instance, meat was returned as unfit and then just minced up to make faggots and sold off as food that was fit to eat. If you look at the DaCosta egg example in America, for instance, they'd been told over and over and over again about the standards, but they wanted to maximise profitability. So a positive food safety culture is where food safety has a high priority. It's core, it's part of the core beliefs of the company that they must produce safe food. So a poor food safety culture is the sort of opposite end of the spectrum, where food safety is considered not very important. Other things are considered more important, and particularly the saving money or maximising profitability. It's an interesting concept is where you get into the middle, which is where you have a complacent culture, and that's sometimes the case either with very large businesses or with businesses which have lots of different outlets. And the example of that might be supermarkets, for instance. That's where the individual store manager or the unit manager would become important. But I did work with one company that where the concept of what the core beliefs and the food safety culture was like was perceived very differently at top management level to shop floor level. And this takes quite a bit of reconciliation, and it illustrates one of the components of a food safety culture, which is communication.
Now I realise this might be slightly different for different types of businesses, but if you wanted to go about developing a positive food safety culture, what would be the important steps to get right, do you think?
Oh, I think the first thing would be to get the book that I wrote on the topic.
Of
course. I think one of the first things is there's a famous quote, I think it was Deming that said it originally, you cannot manage what you cannot measure. So I think the first thing is you need to have an idea of what the culture is like. And I've certainly seen it with different companies. The level of food safety compliance with their own requirements was quite good, but was achieved in quite different ways. That said, I think you've quite clearly got to have a good basic understanding of all the different components. So how do you go about developing one? Well, it starts with assessing the type of culture that you have, and there are various ways in which you can do that. Of course, the classic, and you've had lots of experience of it, the classic industry way is to do audits or inspections. And audits and inspections have their role, and I'm not decrying their use at all, but they often only tell you the superficial level. We haven't got time to talk about exactly what the structure of food safety culture perhaps is, but the outer level of food safety culture is often talked about or considered as food safety climate. And I think audits are quite good at assessing that level of the culture. They may be less good at developing or assessing the more deeper levels. So I think it's almost like if you go for an interview, assessing the culture is more the psychometric tests, whereas the face-to-face interview might be more the climate part of it.
So you would use questionnaire-based tools?
There are a selection. I've produced some, the FSA has produced some, and I'm sure other people have produced some as well. Approaches you can use to assess the culture within a business. But I think, first of all, you need to know where you are with the different components, the different factors that contribute to culture. Then once you've done that, you can start to produce a strategy plan for improving the food safety culture. And I think one of the components of that is leadership and standards. Leadership is a very important component of it. I think Frank Yanis, who's also done a lot of work on food safety culture, says There's a lot talked about food safety management, but very little spoken about food safety culture. So the leadership and the values are important parts of that strategy. And in fact, once you've done that, of course, you have to then communicate your values and so on to within the organisation. And there's examples where poor communication has led to incidents, food poisoning incidents, and other types of incidents. So once you've got leadership and you've established values and so on, you've communicated those, then you've got to try and consider how you're going to train people, because there's a lot spoken about training, and I've done lots of training and it's very valuable. But training in itself doesn't make people behave the way you want them to do. What it does do, however, is it enables them to behave how you want them to do when they're motivated to do so. So obviously you've got to train the workforce, make that important. Then after that, though, you've got to support people. And support comes in a lot of different forms. Clearly, most people immediately think of money, and that's true, but I could give you a couple of examples where you could improve compliance very considerably just by altering your shift working patterns. I was at a deli in Boston, and at 11 o'clock in the morning, everybody did exactly what they should do. Everybody was as hygienic as was required of them. An hour and a half later, they had requests for 200 sandwiches from this office, 100 sandwiches from this office. People were running round in circles. And the practices they should have been implementing all fell by the wayside. Exactly the same I saw in South Africa in a supermarket deli. They had 4 people working there. 2 of them went off at lunch break. When do you think was their busiest time?
Would that be lunch break?
It was their So it's providing support. And then you've got to get people involved and motivated and engaged in the whole process of wanting to practice food safety. Then you've got to assess and monitor what you're doing. And I'm a great believer in data of all different sorts to help you diagnose your food safety culture. Not just the sort of questions or answers or attitudinal things, but it's making use of all your data. Another lovely quote, this time I think was one of the American business gurus, and he said, in God we trust, everybody else must bring data. And I think that's very true. You can use your microbiological data. They don't just tell you about the functioning of your management systems and HACCP and so on. They also tell you about the levels of compliance. And I'm a great believer in that context of what I call the food safety jigsaw, where you use results from cleaning monitoring, for example, because end product microbiological testing tells you what's got into the product. Cleaning and assessing surface cleanliness tells you what's going to get into the product. So it's using all the data and then providing consequences for actions. Now, most people think of consequences of if you don't do something, then something dreadful will happen. But it's been shown that many people respond far better to the more positive elements and the positive rewards. And there's a whole variety of ways you can introduce those into a business. And then finally, going round this circle, using it for continual improvement in something like a plan, do, check, act cycle. So it's trying to go through that cycle, which starts with assessment and going through the
continually improving. Okay. Now that's really helpful, and I'm sure the level of detail you've been able to go into there will help a lot of people understand the concept. Just moving on slightly, do you think food safety culture, is that something that just works within companies, or is it something that can be shared up and down supply chains?
That's an interesting question. If food safety is one of your real core values, then you will only want to buy from a supplier that you are happy with, because you know yourself that the food safety chain is only as strong as the weakest link. So I mean, if it's a true core value, then you want to buy the best food microbiologically and safest raw materials you can get, and you want to pass it on further down the line to the person you're supplying to, because you may have taken all the efforts and it's important for your brand value and so on, but if someone else messes it up further down the line, then you might carry the blame and the responsibility. So I think if it's a true core value, it should work up and down the food chain.
And what about the consumer? Do you think the consumer's got a role to play?
Yes, I mean, it's the strong as its weakest link, and I did some extensive work on consumer food safety, and it's very variable. But how the consumers view food safety is very important, and quite, people come up with all sorts of excuses for why they don't need to practice good hygiene. It won't happen to me, or it'll happen to someone else, or I know how things should be done, but other people don't. So I think, yes, you've got the culture of the individual in there as well. And that until 1990, I think, was largely forgotten. But I think since 1990, the work on consumer culture and consumer behaviour has increased very dramatically. And there's now quite a lot around there. I don't think there's been a lot of work on what consumers know and don't know, but I think we need to go beyond that into much more about why they're doing, and further beyond that, how can we improve things? And this is where you get into techniques like social marketing and so on.
Yeah, okay, no, that's great. So just to round things off then, Chris, just wanted to ask you, in your experience, which is obviously considerable in this area, what do you think are the most important things to get right for product safety and health protection in the food supply chain? So I mean, if you were to give maybe your top 3 things, what would you go for?
I think it's, first of all, recognising that food safety for any food business is not just an economic issue, it's a moral issue. I think it should be the basic value for any company to have, that their food should not cause harm. As I said, it could be your son, your daughter, or niece, nephew, or whatever, that's the next person in the line. And it unfortunately does kill, which we know. So I think it's having it as a crucial moral value within the company. I think it's then developing the right systems, and clearly you know yourself that development of HACCP and related programs can bring about profound improvements if it's done correctly. But it's getting the culture to go with that. To get the culture right, you need to know the type of culture that exists. That means you've got to sort of assess it, and from that develop a strategy for improving it.
And it's really about all these things working together within the business.
Absolutely. It's I think people often separate, compartmentalise things, when really they should be looking at how things integrate and work as a whole.
That's great. Well, thank you very much,
Pleasure.
Chris. That's been a really interesting interview.
Okay.
Thank you.